Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones we can see. Frank Delaney learned this truth the hard way when his family fell apart 15 years ago, leaving him alone with nothing but regrets and a small farm to tend. The 68-year-old widower had made peace with his quiet life until his old donkey Mabel started limping badly. A simple trip to the vet should have been routine. Doc Martinez found a rusted nail in the swollen hoof, but as he worked to clean the infection, something else emerged from the wound. A small, faded toy horse. Frank's heart stopped. He knew that toy. It belonged to his daughter Sarah, lost during that terrible summer when harsh words drove her away forever. But how did it end up buried in his donkey's hoof after all these years? What did this mean for a father who thought he'd lost his chance at forgiveness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Frank Delaney's modest farm as he made his way to the barn, his weathered hands gripping a steaming cup of black coffee. At 68, Frank had settled into a rhythm as predictable as the seasons themselves. Wake at 5:30, coffee first, then check on the animals before the world fully stirred to life. The routine had sustained him through 15 years of solitude, each day blending seamlessly into the next, like water flowing over smooth stones. His work-worn toolbox sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it the night before. Its metal, its corners dulled by decades of honest labor. Frank had been a construction foreman for 37 years before a back injury forced his early retirement. That toolbox had been his companion through countless job sites, its compartments organized with the precision of a man who understood that the right tool in the right place could solve almost any problem except the ones that mattered most. Mabel's ears perked up as Frank approached her stall. The old donkey had been with him longer than any living creature on the farm, a stubborn grey mare with intelligent dark eyes and a personality that matched Frank's own cantankerous nature. He'd bought her as a young foal 23 years ago, back when Margaret was still alive, and Sarah still called this place home. "Morning, girl," Frank murmured, running his hand along Mabel's neck. She nuzzled against his shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become their daily greeting. Frank remembered how Sarah used to feed Mabel sugar cubes from her small palm, giggling when the donkey's whiskers tickled her fingers. Those memories came less frequently now, but they still caught him off guard when they surfaced, like finding a photograph tucked between the pages of an old book. The farm itself wasn't much to look at. 12 acres of rolling pasture bordered by weathered fence posts and overgrown hedgerows. Frank kept a small vegetable garden, a handful of chickens, and 3 goats alongside Mabel. It was enough to keep him busy without being overwhelming, enough to give his days purpose without demanding more than his aging body could provide. Margaret had always dreamed of expanding, maybe adding a few sheep or planting fruit trees along the southern border. Frank had planned to surprise her with apple saplings for their 30th anniversary, but cancer had other plans. Dr. Emily Martinez had been the town's only large animal veterinarian for 12 years, taking over the practice from old Doc Hendricks. When he retired, everyone still called her Doc Martinez, though she'd earned the title through years of dedicated service rather than decades of familiarity. Frank respected her quiet competence and no-nonsense approach to animal care. She never pushed for expensive treatments when simple ones would suffice, and she never made small talk when silence would do just as well. The veterinary clinic sat on Main Street between Chen's hardware store and the post office, its faded blue, siding and hand-painted sign giving it the timeless quality of a place that had always been there and always would be. Frank had made this drive dozens of times over the years, usually for routine checkups or minor ailments that came with keeping livestock. He'd never expected a simple appointment to change everything. Mrs. Chen had been watching Frank's gradual withdrawal from the world with the patient concern of a neighbor who understood grief. Her own husband had passed 5 years earlier, leaving her to run the hardware store alone, She'd made it her unofficial mission to check on the widowers and widows scattered throughout their rural community, bringing casseroles that were never quite requested and offering help that was never quite refused. That Mabel giving you trouble again. She'd asked when Frank stopped by for fence staples the week before. Mrs. Chen had a way of seeing through Frank's carefully maintained facade of self-sufficiency. She noticed when he started buying smaller quantities of feed, when his usual monthly supply runs became sporadic, when the careful maintenance of his property began to show signs of a man losing interest in tomorrow. Frank's house reflected the life of someone who had stopped planning for the future. The living room furniture sat exactly where Margaret had arranged it, her reading glasses still on the side table next to a novel she'd never finished. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, wedding pictures, Sarah's school portraits, holiday gatherings that seemed to belong to different people living different lives. The most recent photo of Sarah showed a 16-year-old girl with her father's stubborn chin and her mother's gentle eyes, taken just months before everything fell apart. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Margaret's cooking, though Frank's meals had devolved into simple combinations of whatever required minimal preparation. He ate standing at the counter more often than not, looking out the window toward the barn, where Mabel and the other animals went about their daily routines, with a contentment that sometimes made Frank envious. Sarah's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it, though Frank wouldn't admit to anyone that he sometimes stood in the doorway, remembering the sound of her laughter echoing through the house. The walls still displayed her childhood artwork, crayon drawings of stick figures that were supposed to be the family, farm animals rendered in impossible shades of purple and green, and a particularly ambitious attempt at capturing Mabel that looked more like a large dog with extremely long ears. The accident had happened on a Tuesday in July, the kind of sweltering summer day when the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. Sarah's best friend, Jenny Rodriguez, had come to spend the afternoon, as she had countless times before. The girls were 14 and 15, old enough to help with farm chores, but young enough to turn any task into an adventure. Frank had been repairing a section of fence near the old equipment shed, working with the focused intensity that had made him a respected foreman, but sometimes made him an inattentive father. He should have noticed when the girls went quiet. He should have realized that silence from two teenagers usually meant trouble. By the time he heard Jenny's screams, it was already too late. The old hay rake had been stored improperly, its rusty tines jutting out at head height. Jenny had been running backward, laughing at something Sarah had said, when she collided with the metal implement. The injury wasn't immediately fatal, but the infection that followed claimed her life 3 weeks later. Sarah blamed herself. Frank blamed himself. Margaret tried to hold everyone together while battling her own guilt over not being there when it happened. The family that had once moved through their days with easy affection became strangers sharing the same roof, each trapped in their own version of grief and responsibility. The final argument came 6 months after Jenny's funeral. Sarah had been accepted to a veterinary program at the state university, a dream she'd nurtured since childhood. Frank, drowning in his own guilt and terrified of losing another person he loved, had forbidden her to go. The words he spoke that night still echoed in his memory with the clarity of fresh wounds. "You're not ready for that kind of responsibility. Look what happened when you were responsible for Jenny." Sarah left the next morning while Frank was in the barn, taking only what she could carry and leaving behind a note that said simply, "I'm sorry I disappointed you." Frank had found the note on her pillow and spent the rest of the day sitting in his truck at the end of the driveway, torn between following her and letting her go. Pride won out over love, as it so often did in the lives of stubborn men who confuse strength with silence. Margaret died 3 years later, the cancer taking her with the same relentless efficiency that had claimed Jenny Rodriguez. Frank had tried to call Sarah then, leaving messages on an answering machine that was never returned. He told himself she was probably busy with school, that grief affected everyone differently, that she would come home when she was ready. But the days stretched into months, and the months stretched into years, and gradually Frank stopped expecting the phone to ring. Now, at 68, Frank had constructed a life of careful routine designed to minimize both surprise and disappointment. He woke at the same time, followed the same patterns, spoke to the same handful of neighbors who still made the effort to include him in the peripheral activities of community life. It was a small life, but it was predictable, and predictability had become Frank's most valued companion. The morning Mabel started limping, Frank's first instinct was to ignore it. Animals got sore feet, just like people did, and most problems resolved themselves given enough time and patience. But as the days passed and the limping worsened, Frank's practical nature overcame his preference for avoiding complications. Mabel wasn't just any animal. She was his last living connection to the time when his family had been whole. Loading Mabel into the trailer required more coaxing than usual. The old donkey seemed to sense that something was different about this trip, that the careful equilibrium of their shared routine was about to be disturbed. Frank had learned to trust Mabel's instincts over the years. Animals possessed a wisdom about change that humans often lacked, an ability to sense shifts in the world's balance long before those shifts became visible to duller senses. As Frank drove toward town, with Mabel shifting restlessly in the trailer behind him, he had no way of knowing that this routine veterinary visit would become the catalyst for the most profound change in his life since Margaret's death. He couldn't know that the small toy horse buried in his donkey's infected hoof would unlock 15 years of carefully guarded grief. He couldn't know that the daughter he'd lost to pride and stubbornness had been carrying her own burden of regret, or that healing sometimes comes disguised as the very thing we've been trying to avoid. All Frank knew was that Mabel needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with such simple motivations. The drive to town took Frank past landmarks that held layers of memory like sediment in a riverbed. The old Miller farm, abandoned now for 7 years, where Sarah had gotten her first job, helping with the summer harvest. The covered bridge, where Margaret used to stop on their Sunday drives to take photographs of the creek running underneath. The cemetery on the hill, where both Margaret and Jenny Rodriguez rested under matching granite headstones, their graves tended by people who remembered them with more grace than Frank had ever managed to remember himself. Frank's relationship with the town had evolved over the years, from active participation to polite observation. He still attended the annual Harvest Festival and showed up for town meetings when issues affected his property, but he'd gradually withdrawn from the social fabric that had once included him and Margaret as a natural pair. Married couples, he'd discovered, moved through the world differently than widowed men. They were invited to dinner parties and included in weekend plans. Single men past a certain age became projects, people to be fixed up with available women or gently encouraged to get back out there, in ways that made Frank's jaw clench with irritation. Mrs. Chen understood this dynamic better than most. Her own widowhood had taught her the peculiar loneliness of being half of a pair that no longer existed. She and Frank had developed an unspoken friendship based on mutual respect for each other's grief and a shared appreciation for practical help, offered without emotional strings attached. She fixed the lock on his mailbox when it broke. He plowed her driveway after snowstorms. Neither of them felt obligated to discuss their feelings or make plans for the future. Doc Martinez's clinic occupied a converted house that had been modified to accommodate large animals without losing its residential charm. The waiting room contained mismatched chairs that looked like they'd been donated by various families over the years, their upholstery telling the story of decades of pet owners and livestock farmers seeking help for creatures they couldn't heal themselves. A bulletin board near the reception desk displayed lost pet flyers, announcements for upcoming livestock auctions, and business cards for farriers, feed suppliers, and other professionals who made their living caring for animals. Frank had called ahead to make an appointment, though Doc Martinez had assured him she could work Mabel into her schedule whenever was convenient. Small-town veterinarians learned to be flexible with their time, understanding that animal emergencies didn't respect office hours and that farmers often traveled significant distances to reach professional care. The clinic served a radius of nearly 50 miles, encompassing dozens of small farms, several horse operations, and the occasional exotic pet that required specialized knowledge. As Frank backed the trailer up to the clinic's loading dock, he noticed how Mabel's ears swiveled constantly, taking in the unfamiliar sounds and scents of a place where many animals had come before her. The donkey's intelligence had always impressed Frank. Unlike horses, which could be trained to ignore their instincts, donkeys maintained a stubborn connection to their own judgment. Mabel would comply with Frank's requests when she deemed them reasonable, but she reserved the right to refuse anything that struck her as potentially dangerous or simply unnecessary. The infection in Mabel's hoof had developed gradually, beginning as a slight tenderness that Frank initially attributed to a stone bruise or minor cut. But as the swelling increased and the donkey's reluctance to put weight on the affected foot became more pronounced, Frank realized this was something beyond his ability to treat with the basic first aid supplies he kept in the barn. He'd cleaned the area as best he could and applied antibiotic ointment, but Mabel's condition continued to deteriorate. Doc Martinez greeted them with the calm professionalism that had earned her the trust of every farmer in the county. She was a woman in her early 40s, with prematurely grey hair, pulled back in a practical ponytail, and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent years working with animals that could kill you if you made the wrong move at the wrong moment. She'd grown up on a ranch in Montana before attending veterinary school, and her background gave her an intuitive understanding of both animal behavior and the farmers who depended on their livestock for their livelihood. "Let's take a look at this foot, Mabel," Doc Martinez said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she used with skittish horses and nervous cattle. Frank watched as she ran her hands along Mabel's leg, checking for heat and swelling with the systematic thoroughness of someone who knew that small problems often revealed larger issues if you knew where to look. The examination revealed the extent of the infection immediately. The hoof wall had separated slightly, creating a pocket where bacteria had taken hold and begun the process of breaking down healthy tissue. Doc Martinez explained her findings in language that Frank could understand without talking down to him. Balance that separated good veterinarians from merely competent ones. "We'll need to open this up and clean it out thoroughly," she said, already moving toward her instrument tray with the efficiency of someone who'd performed this procedure hundreds of times. "It looks like something got lodged in here and created the perfect environment for infection. And probably a nail or piece of wire, judging by the angle of the wound tract." Frank held Mabel's lead rope while Doc Martinez prepared her instruments and sedative. The donkey stood calmly, as if she understood that these strangers were trying to help rather than harm her. Frank had always marveled at animals' ability to sense intention. Mabel had never warmed to people who were impatient or rough with her, but she seemed to recognize Doc Martinez's gentle competence immediately. The sedative took effect quickly, and Mabel's head drooped as the medication relaxed her nervous system. Frank continued to hold her steady, while Doc Martinez began the delicate process of cleaning the infected tissue from the hoof. The smell of infection was familiar to anyone who'd spent time around livestock, but it never became pleasant. Frank breathed through his mouth and focused on keeping Mabel calm while the veterinarian worked. "There's definitely something foreign in here," Doc Martinez murmured, probing carefully with a sterile instrument. "Whatever it is, it's been there for a while. The tissue has grown around it." She paused, concentrating on her work, then looked up with a puzzled expression. This is interesting. I'm finding more than one object. Frank leaned closer, trying to see what had caused his donkey such distress. Doc Martinez worked with the patient precision of someone who understood that rushing could cause more damage than healing. She removed what appeared to be a rusty nail first, exactly what Frank had expected to find based on her initial assessment. But as she continued probing the wound, something else began to emerge from the infected tissue. "Well, I'll be, Docky," Martinez said softly, holding up a small object for Frank to see. "When's the last time you cleaned out your barn?" Frank stared at the object in the veterinarian's tweezers, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. It was a small plastic horse, no bigger than his thumb, painted in colors that had faded but were still recognizable. Pink mane, white body, blue saddle. A child's toy, the kind that came in sets of farm animals or fairy tale figures. The world seemed to tilt slightly as recognition hit Frank like a physical blow. He knew that toy. He remembered buying it as part of a set for Sarah's 7th birthday, remembered her delight as she arranged the tiny horses in elaborate scenarios on her bedroom floor, remembered finding them scattered throughout the house in the weeks and months that followed. But this particular horse, this one had been special. Sarah had named her Princess, and Princess had been her constant companion during the summer before everything went wrong. Frank could see his daughter's small hands now, cradling the toy, as she told him elaborate stories about Princess's adventures on their farm. He could hear her voice, bright with the kind of imagination that sees magic in ordinary things. "Do you recognize it?" Doc Martinez asked gently, clearly sensing the emotional impact the discovery was having on Frank. Frank nodded, unable to trust his voice. His hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the toy, this small piece of his daughter's childhood that had somehow found its way into his donkey's hoof after 15 years of separation. Frank's fingers closed around the small plastic horse, and 15 years of carefully constructed emotional distance crumbled in an instant. The toy felt impossibly light in his weathered palm, yet it carried the weight of every mistake he'd made as a father, every harsh word he'd spoken in grief. Every day he'd let pride stand between him and the daughter he'd driven away. Doc Martinez continued working on Mabel's hoof with professional focus, but Frank could sense her awareness of his distress. Good veterinarians learned to read people as well as animals, understanding that the humans who brought sick creatures for healing often carried wounds of their own that couldn't be treated with antiseptics and sutures. "That's quite a discovery," she said quietly, not looking up from her work. "Must have been there for years, judging by how the tissue had grown around it." Frank turned the toy over in his hands, examining it with the intensity of an archaeologist studying an ancient artifact. The paint had faded and chipped, but Princess was unmistakably the same horse that had lived in his daughter's imagination, the tiny plastic companion that had witnessed Sarah's childhood dreams and fears. How had it ended up buried in Mabel's? Hoof. When had Sarah lost it? And under what circumstances? The questions multiplied in Frank's mind like ripples spreading across still water. Each possible answer led to more questions, more implications, more reminders of how much he didn't know about his daughter's life, or his own failure to know it. "She used to carry that everywhere," Frank said, his voice rough with emotions. He hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Sarah, my daughter, Princess was her favorite." Doc Martinez glanced up briefly, her expression gentle but carefully neutral. "Children and their special toys. I remember having a stuffed elephant I couldn't sleep without. Drove my parents crazy because I'd lose track of it constantly." The comparison was meant to be comforting, but it only intensified Frank's anguish. Normal children lost toys and found them again. Normal fathers helped with the searching and celebrated. The reunion. Frank had been many things to Sarah, but normal had never been one of them. Even before the accident, even before Margaret's death, Frank had struggled with the emotional demands of fatherhood. He understood how to provide, how to protect, how to teach practical skills. The softer requirements, comfort, encouragement, unconditional acceptance, had always felt as foreign to him as speaking a language he'd never learned. Margaret had bridged that gap effortlessly. She'd been fluent in the language of childhood, able to translate Sarah's needs into terms Frank could understand and respond to. When Sarah scraped her knee, Margaret handled the tears, while Frank handled the bandage. When Sarah had nightmares, Margaret provided comfort while Frank checked the locks and assured her the house was safe. They'd been a team, complementing each other's strengths and compensating for each other's limitations. After Margaret's death, Frank had tried to be both parents to Sarah, but grief had made him rigid when he needed to be flexible, demanding when he needed to be understanding. The accident with Jenny Rodriguez had shattered what remained of his confidence as a protector, leaving him with nothing but the blunt tools of authority and discipline. Tools utterly inadequate for helping a teenage girl process trauma and guilt. "Do you mind if I ask what happened?" Doc Martinez said, as she finished cleaning the wound and began applying antiseptic. "With your daughter, I mean. You don't have to answer if it's too personal." Frank found himself wanting to tell her everything. This calm woman who worked with gentle hands and asked questions without judgment. The story had been locked inside him for so long that he'd almost forgotten it had a beginning, middle, and end, that it wasn't just a permanent condition of his existence, but something that had actually happened to real people in a specific time and place. "There was an accident," Frank began slowly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Sarah's best friend was killed, here on the farm. I blamed myself, Sarah blamed herself, and instead of helping each other through it, we just—" He stopped, searching for words that could capture 15 years of regret. "We just fell apart. I said things I shouldn't have said. She left, and I let her go." Doc Martinez nodded, her hands never pausing in their work. "Grief does that sometimes. Makes us our worst selves right when we need to be our best selves. How long has it been since you've spoken to her?" 15 years, Frank said, and hearing the number spoken aloud made it sound both impossibly long and devastatingly final. "She tried to call when my wife died. But I was—" He paused again, remembering those dark months when answering the phone had felt like volunteering for fresh pain. "I wasn't ready to talk to anyone then, especially not her." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that had burned down to embers but never quite gone out. Frank realized he'd never spoken these words to another person, never acknowledged the full scope of his failure as a father and husband. He'd carried the knowledge alone, letting it poison his days and haunt his nights, but he'd never given. Doc Martinez finished bandaging Mabel's hoof and began packing away her instruments. The donkey was starting to shake off the effects of the sedative, her head lifting as awareness returned to her dark eyes. In a few minutes, she would be ready to load back into the trailer and return to the familiar rhythms of farm life. But Frank knew he wouldn't be the same man who'd brought her to town that morning. "Frank," Doc Martinez said, her tone shifting from professional to personal, "I don't know your daughter, and I don't know the specifics of what happened between you two, but I do know something about healing." She gestured toward Mabel's treated hoof. "Sometimes infections go so deep that you think the damage is permanent. But if you're willing to open up the wound and clean out what's been festering, amazing things can happen. Tissue that looked dead starts growing again. Function returns. Not overnight and not without some pain, but healing happens." Frank understood the metaphor, but understanding and acting were different things entirely. The emotional wound he'd been carrying felt too deep, too infected with years of accumulated guilt and shame, to respond to any kind of treatment. And even if healing were possible, it would require Sarah's participation, something he had no right to expect after 15 years of silence. "What if it's too late?" Frank asked, voicing the fear that had kept him paralyzed for so long. "What if she doesn't want anything to do with me anymore?" "Then at least you'll know," Doc Martinez replied simply. "Right now you're living with assumptions and fears instead of facts. That's no way to spend whatever years you have left." Frank helped load Mabel back into the trailer, his movements automatic, while his mind wrestled with possibilities he'd spent 15 years refusing to. consider. The toy horse sat in his shirt pocket like a tiny beacon, its presence both comforting and terrifying. Sarah had lost it here somehow, but when and why? As he drove home, Frank found himself remembering Margaret's wooden letterbox, the one she'd kept on their dresser filled with cards and notes from their courtship days. She'd been a writer of letters, someone who believed that important things deserved to be put down on paper where they could be read and reread, treasured and preserved. Frank had always been better with actions than words, more comfortable showing love through work and provision than through conversation and emotional expression. But Margaret's letters had taught him that words had their own kind of power, their own way of bridging distance and time. In the months after her death, Frank had read through those letters obsessively, finding comfort in the voice she'd captured on paper, a voice that remained clear and loving long after her physical voice had been silenced by illness. Maybe Sarah deserved words from him now, the kind of words he'd never learned to say when she was young and still believed he could do no wrong. Maybe 15 years of silence had been enough penance for one lifetime. And maybe healing really was possible if he could find the courage to clean out wounds that had been festering far too long. The drive home took Frank past the cemetery where Jenny Rodriguez lay buried beneath a simple headstone, her life reduced to 2 dates and a brief inscription about beloved daughter and friend. Frank had attended her funeral, standing in the back, while the Rodriguez family grieved for their child, and Frank grieved for his own failures as a protector and guide. He'd never visited her grave after that day, never brought flowers or said the prayers that might have offered comfort to Jenny's family. Shame had kept him away, the knowledge that his negligence had contributed to a tragedy that had rippled through multiple families like stones thrown into still water. But now, with Sarah's toy horse in his pocket and Doc Martinez's words echoing in his mind, Frank wondered if he'd been carrying the wrong kind of guilt all these years. Maybe the real sin wasn't the accident itself. Accidents happened on farms, despite every precaution, but the way he'd let that accident destroy everything good that remained in his life. Maybe it wasn't too late to change course. Frank's hands shook as he unlocked the front door of his house, Sarah's toy horse still clutched in his palm like a talisman against the loneliness that had defined his days for so long. The familiar creak of the hinges and the musty smell of a house where only one person lived seemed different now, charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. He set the toy on the kitchen counter and stared at it for several long minutes, trying to reconcile this small piece of plastic with the enormous emotional upheaval it had triggered. Princess looked so ordinary sitting there next to his coffee cup and yesterday's mail, just a faded child's plaything that most people would have thrown away without a second thought. But Frank could see Sarah's 7-year-old hands arranging Princess alongside her other toys, hear her voice spinning elaborate stories about adventures and friendships and happy endings. The house felt different now, as if Sarah's presence had somehow been awakened by the discovery of her lost toy. Frank found himself moving through rooms he'd avoided for years, drawn by an urgency he couldn't quite name. He climbed the stairs to the second floor for the first time in months, his knees protesting the unaccustomed effort, and stood outside, Sarah's bedroom door like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. The room looked exactly as it had the day she left, frozen in the amber of his grief and regret. Her single bed was still covered with the purple and white quilt Margaret had sewn, its careful stitching now faded but intact. Books lined the shelves, horse stories and mysteries, and the science texts she'd loved even as a child. Her desk held the remnants of teenage life, dried-up pens, a half-finished homework assignment, a small mirror surrounded by photographs of friends who were now adults with lives and families of their own. But it was the artwork that drew Frank's attention. Now the crayon drawings and watercolor paintings that covered one entire wall like a gallery of childhood dreams. Sarah had been artistic from an early age, constantly creating pictures of the world as she saw it, or as she wished it could be. Most of the drawings featured the farm, stick-figure versions of Frank and Margaret, animals rendered in impossible, and colors, and always, Mabel appearing in various scenes as a benevolent presence watching over the family. Frank studied a particular drawing that showed the three of them, Frank, Margaret and Sarah, standing in front of the barn with exaggerated smiles and arms that reached nearly to their feet. Mabel stood beside them, her ears comically oversized, her expression somehow conveying both dignity and affection, despite being drawn by a child who hadn't yet mastered perspective or proportion. "Happy Family" was written across the bottom in Sarah's careful 8-year-old handwriting, the letters slightly uneven, but filled with the confidence of a child who believed such happiness was permanent and unshakable. Frank remembered the day she'd presented this drawing to him, how proud she'd been of her artistic achievement, how he'd praised her work before Margaret hung it in the place of honor where it still resided. When had he stopped noticing Sarah's art? When had he become too busy or too tired or too focused on practical concerns to appreciate these windows into his daughter's heart? Looking at the drawings now, Frank could see themes that had escaped his attention 15 years ago. Child's deep love for her family, her connection to the animals they cared for, her fundamental optimism about the world and her place in it. He found himself searching through the drawings for signs of Princess, and there she was in several scenes, a tiny pink horse galloping, alongside Mabel in one picture, standing guard over a barn full of sleeping animals in another. Sarah had included her beloved toy in her artistic vision of their family life, making Princess as much a part of their story as any of the flesh and blood. Creatures on the farm. A soft knock on the front door interrupted Frank's exploration of his daughter's preserved childhood. He descended the stairs slowly, still holding one of Sarah's drawings, a picture of Princess and Mabel sharing an apple beneath a tree that bore both fruit and flowers simultaneously, the kind of magical thinking that belonged exclusively to children who hadn't yet learned the limits of possibility. Mrs. Chen stood on his front porch, holding a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone who'd noticed a change in a neighbor's routine and had come to investigate with the excuse of offering food. Frank had learned to recognize this look over the years, the gentle concern disguised as casual social interaction that characterized the way his community looked after its more isolated members. "I made too much chicken and rice," she said, though. Frank knew perfectly well that Mrs. Chen never made too much of anything. She cooked with the precision of someone who'd been feeding a family for decades, and her occasional surplus meals always seemed to coincide with times when Frank appeared to need feeding most. "Come in," Frank said, stepping aside to let her enter. He realized he was still holding Sarah's drawing and felt a flush of embarrassment, as if he'd been caught doing something private and potentially shameful. Mrs. Chen noticed the drawing immediately, as Frank had known she would. She had an artist's eye and had always admired Sarah's childhood creations during the years when the Chen family had been regular visitors to the Delaney farm. Her own children were grown now, scattered across the country, pursuing careers and families of their own. But she remembered the time when all the neighborhood children had moved freely between houses, creating an extended community of shared responsibility and mutual care. "Sarah's drawing," she observed, her tone carefully neutral. "I haven't seen her artwork in years. She had such talent even as a little girl." Frank found himself telling Mrs. Chen about the morning's discovery, the words coming easier than they had with Doc Martinez. Perhaps because Mrs. Chen had known Sarah, had watched her grow from a toddler into a teenager, had been present during the happy years before everything went wrong. Mrs. Chen listened without interruption, her weathered face reflecting a lifetime of experience with family complications and the ways that grief could poison relationships that had once been sources of joy. When Frank finished his account, she remained quiet for several minutes, processing what she'd heard with the thoughtfulness that came from having raised 4 children and buried a husband. "You know," she said finally, "I always wondered what happened to that little horse. Sarah carried it everywhere during those last few months before she left. I remember seeing her with it at the farmer's market, holding it while you and Margaret were buying vegetables. She seemed to need it then, like it was a comfort to her when everything else felt uncertain. Frank absorbed this information, adding it to the growing collection of details about his daughter's emotional state during those final months at home. He'd been so focused on his own grief and guilt that he'd missed the signs of Sarah's distress, the small ways she'd tried to hold on to security and comfort in a world that suddenly felt dangerous and unpredictable. "She was here recently," Mrs. Chen said quietly, her words landing in Frank's consciousness like stones dropped into deep water. "I saw a car I didn't recognize parked at the end of your driveway about a month ago. When I walked over to see if someone needed help, the driver took off quickly, but I got a glimpse of her before she left." Frank stared at his neighbor, processing the implications of what she'd just revealed. Sarah had been here, on his property, close enough to see the house where she'd grown up. She'd driven all the way from wherever she lived now, had sat in her car looking at the life she'd left behind. And then she'd driven away without making contact, perhaps because she'd lost her nerve, or perhaps because she'd decided he wasn't worth the risk of reopening old wounds. The toy horse on his kitchen counter suddenly made perfect sense. Sarah had been here, had walked around the property she'd once called home. She'd dropped Princess somehow, maybe deliberately, maybe accidentally. And Mabel, with her habit of investigating anything unusual in her territory, had stepped on it at just the wrong angle. The revelation that Sarah had been at his farm without his knowledge hit Frank like a physical blow. He sank into one of Margaret's old kitchen chairs, the drawing still clutched in his hands, while Mrs. Chen moved around his kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd been helping neighbors for decades. She put the kettle on for tea and began unpacking her covered dish, creating the kind of domestic normalcy that Frank hadn't experienced in years. "Why didn't you tell me?" Frank asked, his voice hoarse with emotions he was still learning to name. "When you saw her, why didn't you come get me?" Mrs. Chen paused in her movements, her expression thoughtful and sad. "Because she left so quickly when she saw me coming, like a deer that's been startled. I thought maybe she needed time to work up her courage, that she might come back when she was ready. I didn't want to push something that needed to happen. Naturally." Frank understood her logic, but understanding didn't diminish the ache of missed opportunity. Sarah had been so close he could have walked to the end of his driveway and spoken to her. They could have started the conversation that had been 15 years in the making. Instead, she'd driven away carrying whatever burdens had brought her there in the first place. Did she look? Frank started, then stopped, unsure how to ask what he really wanted to know. Did she look happy? Did she look like someone who'd built a good life despite his failures as a father? Did she look like someone who might forgive him if he found the courage to ask? "She looked like you," Mrs. Chen said gently. "Older, of course, but still your daughter, still Sarah." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that Frank was only beginning to unpack. Sarah was still his daughter, despite the years and the silence and the harsh words that had driven her away. Whatever else had changed in her life, that fundamental connection remained intact, waiting to be acknowledged and nurtured back to health. After Mrs. Chen left, Frank found himself drawn to the computer that had sat unused in Margaret's old sewing room for months. He'd bought it during her final illness, thinking it might help them stay connected with distant relatives and old friends. But Margaret had been too sick to learn its intricacies, and Frank had been too overwhelmed with caregiving to master it himself. Since her death, the machine had gathered dust while Frank convinced himself he was too old to learn new technology. But the need to find Sarah now outweighed his technological intimidation. He spent the better part of the afternoon fumbling through the process of connecting to the internet, following the handwritten instructions Margaret had left beside the keyboard during her brief attempts to explore the digital world. The machine was slow and temperamental, but eventually Frank managed to navigate to something called a search engine. Typing his daughter's name into the search box felt like stepping across a threshold he'd avoided for 15 years. Sarah Delaney yielded thousands of results, most of them for people who weren't his daughter. But gradually Frank learned to narrow his search by adding details he remembered: her birth year, their town's name, keywords related to her childhood dream of working with animals. The first real result that appeared was a staff page for a veterinary clinic in a town about 200 miles away. Frank's heart hammered as he clicked on the link and saw a professional photograph of a woman who was unmistakably his daughter, though she looked so different from the angry teenager who'd left his house 15 years ago that he might have passed her on the street without recognition. Sarah Delaney Walsh, DVM, the page declared. Veterinary technician specializing in large animal care. The photograph showed a confident woman in her 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and eyes that still held traces of the curiosity that had driven her to ask endless questions as a child. She was smiling at the camera with the kind of genuine warmth that suggested she'd found her place in the world, despite the traumatic start to her adult life. Frank read the brief biography that accompanied her photograph, absorbing details about his daughter's life that felt both intimately familiar and completely foreign. She'd earned her veterinary degree from the state university, the same program he'd forbidden her to attend all those years ago. She specialized in equine and livestock care, working with farmers and ranchers to maintain the health of animals that were both beloved companions and essential livelihood. She was married to someone named David Walsh, which explained the hyphenated surname. Frank found himself wondering about this man who'd won his daughter's heart, whether he was kind to her, whether he understood the shadows that her childhood had cast across her adult life. Did he know about the farm where she'd grown up? Did he know about the father who'd failed her when she needed him most? The biography mentioned 2 children, but didn't include their names or ages. Frank stared at those words until they blurred on the screen, processing the fact that he was a grandfather to children he'd never met, would never know unless he found the courage to bridge 15 years of silence and regret. The website included contact information for the veterinary clinic where Sarah worked, a physical address and phone number that represented the most concrete connection Frank had had to his daughter since the day she'd walked out of his life. He wrote the information down in his careful handwriting, then stared at the paper as if it might transform into something less terrifying if he looked at it long enough. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of possibility and fear. Frank found himself moving restlessly through his house, picking up objects that held memories of Sarah's childhood, her high school yearbook, a 4-H ribbon she'd won for a photography project, a birthday card she'd made for him when she was 9 years old. Each artifact told part of the story of a girl who'd grown up believing her father was a hero, only to discover he was merely human in the most devastating way possible. The official accident report still sat in his filing cabinet, where he'd placed it 15 years ago and tried to forget its existence. Frank had read it so many times in the weeks following Jenny Rodriguez's death that he could recite portions of it from memory. Equipment improperly stored, inadequate safety protocols. Contributing factors included lack of supervision and failure to maintain clear pathways in work areas. The language was clinical and precise, reducing a tragedy that had destroyed multiple lives to a series of bullet points and recommendations for preventing similar incidents. Frank had used that report like a weapon against himself, proof of his negligence and unfitness as a protector. But now, looking at it with eyes that had been opened by Doc Martinez's words about healing, he wondered if he'd been reading it wrong all these years. Accidents happened on farms. That was an inescapable reality of working with heavy equipment, large animals, and the countless variables that made agricultural life both rewarding and dangerous. The question wasn't whether Frank bore responsibility for Jenny's death. He did, and no amount of self-forgiveness would change that fact. The question was whether that responsibility needed to poison the rest of his life and prevent him from connecting with the people who still mattered to him. Sarah had lost her mother and her best friend within 3 years, 2 devastating losses that would have challenged any teenager's ability to cope. Frank had added to that burden by becoming another loss, another source of pain in a life that had already contained too much grief. But she'd survived and apparently thrived, building a career that honored her childhood love of animals and creating a family that could give her the stability and love she'd been denied in her formative years. Maybe it was time for Frank to stop punishing himself for the past and start thinking about what kind of future might still be possible. Maybe healing really could happen if he found the courage to clean out wounds that had been festering for far too long. Frank woke before dawn the next morning with Sarah's toy horse on his nightstand and her professional photograph printed from the computer sitting beside it. The contrast between the faded plastic toy and the confident woman in the veterinary clinic portrait seemed to encompass everything he'd lost during the 15 years of silence. Not just his relationship with his daughter, but his understanding of who she'd become without him. Sleep had been elusive, interrupted by dreams that mixed memories of Sarah's childhood with imaginary scenes of the life she'd built as an adult. Frank found himself wondering about the mundane details that fathers were supposed to know. What kind of coffee she drank in the morning, whether she still hummed while doing chores the way she had as a child, what stories she told her own children. At bedtime, he made his way downstairs as the eastern sky began to lighten, following the same routine that had structured his days for years. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility, and weighted with the knowledge that his solitary existence was a choice rather than an inevitable consequence of loss. He could continue living in the careful isolation he'd constructed, or he could risk the vulnerability that came with reaching out to someone who had every right to reject his overture. Margaret's recipe book sat on the kitchen shelf where it had gathered dust for years, its pages filled with handwritten instructions for the meals that had once made their house feel like a home. Frank pulled it down and opened it randomly, finding himself looking at Sarah's favorite chocolate chip cookies, complete with Margaret's notes about doubling the vanilla and using dark chocolate chips because Sarah says they taste more sophisticated. The margins of the recipe book revealed a conversation between mother and daughter that had continued long after Frank had stopped paying attention to such details. Notes about Sarah's preferences, modifications requested during her teenage years, reminders about special occasions when certain dishes were expected. Margaret had been the keeper of family traditions, the one who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and the small celebrations that gave meaning to ordinary days. After Margaret's death, Frank had let those traditions die with her, unable to imagine maintaining them alone and unwilling to risk the pain that came with memories of happier times. But now he wondered if abandoning those rituals had been another form of abandoning Sarah, another way of communicating that the life they'd shared as a family was too painful to remember. Frank found the recipe for Sarah's favorite birthday cake, a lemon layer cake with cream cheese frosting that Margaret had made every year from Sarah's 5th birthday until the final one they'd celebrated together. The recipe card was stained and worn from repeated use, evidence of the care that had gone into creating these moments of sweetness in his daughter's life. "Make sure the layers are completely cool before frosting," Margaret had written in the margin, "or Sarah will be devastated if it looks messy. She likes her cakes to look perfect, even more than she likes them to taste good." The note revealed something about Sarah's personality that Frank had forgotten: her attention to detail, her desire for things to be done properly and with care. Those qualities had probably served her well in veterinary school, where precision could mean the difference between healing and harm. But they also suggested that Sarah would approach any potential reconciliation with her father with the same careful consideration she brought to everything else in her life. Frank spent the morning working in his vegetable garden, pulling weeds and harvesting tomatoes, while his mind wrestled with the decision that had been building since he'd found Princess in Mabel's hoof. The physical work helped him think, the familiar rhythm of tending growing things, providing a counterpoint to the emotional turmoil that had disrupted his carefully ordered existence. Mrs. Chen appeared at the garden gate around 10 o'clock, carrying a thermos of iced tea and wearing the expression of someone who'd given considerable thought to a friend's problem. Frank had learned to appreciate her direct approach to difficult conversations, the way she could address sensitive topics without making them feel intrusive or overwhelming. "You look like a man who didn't sleep much," she observed, settling onto the garden bench that Margaret had positioned to catch the morning sun. "Want to talk about what you're thinking?" Frank continued working while he spoke, finding it easier to discuss his fears and hopes while his hands were busy with tangible tasks. He told Mrs. Chen about finding Sarah's professional information online, about the photographs and biographical details that had revealed so much about the woman his daughter had become. He confessed his terror at the thought of reaching out to her and his equal terror at the thought of letting this opportunity slip away. "You know what I think?" Mrs. Chen said when Frank had finished explaining his dilemma. "I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. You're her father. She was here a month ago, which means she's been thinking about you too. Maybe she's just as scared as you are." The suggestion that Sarah might be struggling with her own fears hadn't occurred to Frank. He'd been so focused on his own guilt and regret that he'd failed to consider her perspective, the possibility that she might be carrying her own burden of unfinished business and unresolved emotions. "What if she hangs up on me?" Frank asked, voicing one of the fears that had kept him awake the previous night. "What if she wants nothing to do with me?" "Then you'll know," Mrs. Chen replied, echoing the words Doc Martinez had spoken the day before. "But what if she doesn't hang up? What if she's been waiting for you to call just as long as you've been afraid to pick up the phone?" That afternoon, Frank found himself at the library in town, seeking help from the librarian with the computer skills he lacked. The library had embraced modern technology in ways that occasionally intimidated its older patrons, but the staff had developed a gentle expertise in helping people navigate digital communications that felt foreign and overwhelming. Sarah Martinez, no relation to Doc Martinez, despite the shared surname, was the head librarian, a woman in her 40s who'd grown up in town before leaving for college and returning with a degree in library science and a mission to connect her community with the wider world through technology. She'd helped dozens of older residents learn to use email and social media to stay connected with distant family members. "I need to find someone," Frank told her, then corrected himself. "I need to contact someone. My daughter. I found her workplace online, but I don't know how to—" He gestured helplessly at the computer screen, unable to articulate the combination of technological confusion and emotional paralysis that had brought him to seek help. Sarah Martinez understood immediately, having guided many similar conversations over the years. "Let's start with what you know and figure out the best way to reach out," she said, pulling up a chair beside his workstation. "Sometimes the hardest part is just taking that first step." With her patient guidance, Frank learned about email addresses and social media profiles, about the various ways that people in the modern world maintained connections across distance and time. Sarah's veterinary clinic had a contact form on their website, a professional channel that might feel less invasive than trying to find her personal information. "You could send a message through her work," Sarah Martinez suggested. "Professional and respectful, but personal enough to let her know who you are and why you're reaching out. Give her the opportunity to respond in her own time and in her own way." Frank stared at the blank message form on the computer screen, paralyzed by the weight of everything he wanted to say and his inability to find words adequate to the task. How did you compress 15 years of regret into a message that wouldn't overwhelm or frighten someone who had every reason to want nothing to do with you? Start simple, Sarah Martinez advised. Tell her who you are, mention something that connects you to shared history, and let her know you'd like to talk if she's willing. Don't try to explain everything in the first message. Just open the door and see if she's ready to walk through it. Frank began typing slowly, his fingers clumsy on the unfamiliar keyboard, each word carefully considered and reconsidered before being committed to the screen. The message Frank finally composed was simple and heartbreaking in its directness. Dear Sarah, this is your father, Frank Delaney. I found something that belongs to you, a small plastic horse named Princess. It was embedded in Mabel's hoof, and Doc Martinez had to remove it during treatment. I know this might seem strange after so many years, but I would like to talk to you if you're willing. I have many things I should have said long ago. My phone number is the same as it always was. I understand if you prefer not to respond. Love. Dad, he stared at the words for 20 minutes before finding the courage to click the send button, each second stretching into an eternity of second-guessing and regret. Sarah Martinez waited patiently beside him, understanding that this moment represented far more than a simple email transmission. It was a man reaching across 15 years of silence to touch the life of someone he'd failed when it mattered. Most there, she said softly when the message disappeared into the digital ether. You've taken the hardest step. Now you wait and see what happens. Frank drove home in a state of suspended animation, simultaneously hopeful and terrified about what he'd set in motion. The afternoon stretched ahead of him with unbearable slowness, every minute feeling like an hour as he waited for a response. That might never come. He found himself checking the computer every few minutes, then forcing himself to stay away from it for increasingly shorter periods. To distract himself from the agony of waiting, Frank decided to visit the cemetery where Jenny Rodriguez was buried. He hadn't been there since her funeral 15 years ago, but guilt and grief had preserved every detail of that terrible day in his memory. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the valley, its old oak trees providing shade for headstones that marked the passage of generations in their small community. Frank had no trouble finding Jenny's grave, though 15 years of weather had softened the sharp edges of her headstone, and lichen had begun to pattern the granite surface with subtle colors. Someone had been caring for the plot. Fresh flowers sat in a small vase, and the grass around the headstone was neatly trimmed. Frank realized it must be Jenny's mother, Maria Rodriguez, who still visited her daughter's resting place regularly. I should have come before now, Frank said aloud, feeling foolish, but needing to speak the words that had been building inside him for a decade and a half. I should have been here to remember her properly, to honor what she meant to Sarah and to all of us. The wooden cross he'd carved in the weeks following Jenny's death still sat in his workshop, unfinished and abandoned, when grief had made the task too painful to complete. Frank had intended to place it on her grave as a gesture of remembrance and apology, but shame had prevented him from following through on even that small act of contrition. He was lost in memories of that terrible summer when a voice behind him said his name. Frank turned to see Maria Rodriguez walking up the hill, carrying a fresh bouquet of wildflowers, her face showing the kind of peaceful sadness that comes with years of practice at grieving well. Mrs. Rodriguez, Frank said, his voice rough with emotions he'd been trying to suppress. I'm sorry for everything. I should have. Maria held up a hand to stop his apology, then surprised him by reaching out to touch his arm with gentle firmness. Frank Delaney, she said, you've been carrying guilt that was never yours to carry. What happened to Jenny was a terrible accident, nothing more and nothing less. Frank stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. For 15 years, he'd lived with the certainty that everyone in town blamed him for Jenny's death, that his negligence had destroyed an innocent life and shattered a family's future. The possibility that Jenny's own mother might not hold him responsible had never occurred to him. But the equipment, Frank began, the safety protocols, were the same as every other farm in the county. Maria interrupted gently. Jenny knew the dangers, just like Sarah knew them, just like every farm child learns to navigate the risks that come with that life. What happened could have happened anywhere, to anyone. It was just her time. They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes, two people who'd been shaped by the same tragedy in different ways. Frank realized that Maria had found a kind of peace that had eluded him completely, an acceptance of loss that didn't require blame or punishment to give it meaning. "I've stayed in touch with Sarah over the years," Maria said eventually, and Frank felt his heart skip a beat at this unexpected revelation. "She calls me on Jenny's birthday every year, and we talk about old times. She's done well for herself, your daughter, became the veterinarian she always dreamed of being." Frank absorbed this information slowly, understanding that Sarah had maintained connections to their shared past, even while avoiding contact with him. She'd found a way to honor Jenny's memory and preserve the good parts of her childhood while protecting herself from the pain that her relationship with her father represented. "She's been carrying guilt too," Maria continued, her words landing like stones in still water. "Different guilt than yours, but guilt all the same. She thinks she caused the accident somehow, that if she'd been paying attention or made different choices that day, Jenny would still be alive." The revelation hit Frank with devastating force. While he'd been punishing himself for failing to protect the girls, Sarah had been punishing herself for failing to protect her friend. They'd both been trapped by their own versions of responsibility and regret, each carrying burdens that belonged to tragedy itself rather than to any individual failure. "She tried to come home after your wife died," Maria said gently. "Called me crying, asking if I thought you'd want to see her. I told her that grief makes people do strange things, that she should give you time to process the loss. Maybe that was wrong advice, but I was trying to protect both of you from more pain." Frank understood now why his phone had rung so many times during those dark months after Margaret's death, why he'd hung up on numbers he didn't recognize. Sarah had been trying to come home to him, and he'd rejected her attempts at reconciliation because he'd been too buried in his own grief to recognize love when it reached out to him. "She visits his grave every year on the anniversary," Maria said, gesturing toward Jenny's headstone, "brings flowers and sits here for hours, talking to Jenny like they're still children planning their next adventure. And she asks about you every time, whether you're doing well, whether you seem lonely." The picture Maria painted was of a daughter who'd never stopped loving her father, despite the harsh words that had driven her away, who'd found ways to stay connected to her hometown and its people, even while maintaining distance from the source of her deepest hurt. "What should I do?" Frank asked, voicing the question that had been consuming him since he'd found Princess in Mabel's hoof. "How do I bridge 15 years of silence and stubbornness?" Maria smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Frank had seen from her since Jenny's death. "You start by admitting that you've been just as scared and stubborn as she has," she said. "And then you trust that the love that brought her back here a month ago is stronger than the fear that's kept you apart." Frank drove home from the cemetery with his mind reeling from Maria Rodriguez's revelations. The knowledge that Sarah had been thinking about him, asking about him, even trying to contact him, transformed everything he thought he understood about their 15-year estrangement. He wasn't the only one carrying regret and longing. His daughter had been struggling with her own burden of unfinished business. When he reached his house, Frank went immediately to the computer to check for a response to his email. The inbox showed no new messages, but it had been less than 4 hours since he'd sent his tentative overture. He reminded himself that Sarah was probably at work, caring for animals and their worried owners, living the productive life she'd built despite the traumatic foundation of her early adulthood. Unable to sit still, Frank found himself drawn back to Jenny Rodriguez's grave later that evening. Maria had mentioned that Sarah visited every year on the anniversary of the accident, but Frank realized he'd never paid attention to when that anniversary fell. The date was carved into his memory as the worst day of his life, but he'd spent 15 years trying to forget rather than remember. July 15th. The accident had happened on July 15th, and today was July 13th. If Sarah maintained her annual pilgrimage to Jenny's grave, she would be here in 2 days. The realization sent a shock of possibility and terror through Frank's system. Sarah might come home in 2 days. She might drive past his farm, might even stop to visit if she'd found the courage that had been building since she'd lost Princess during her secret reconnaissance mission a month ago. Frank spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of this timing. Was it coincidence that he'd found Princess just days before Sarah's annual visit, or was there some deeper pattern at work? He'd never been a man given to believing in fate or divine intervention, but the convergence of events felt too meaningful to dismiss as random chance. The next morning brought an email response that made Frank's hands shake as he opened it. "Dad, I can't believe you found Princess. I lost her when I came to the farm last month. I wanted to see the place where I grew up, but I wasn't ready to face you yet. I've been trying to work up the courage to contact you for years, especially after Mom died. I have so much I need to say to you, things I should have said 15 years ago. I'll be at Jenny's grave tomorrow afternoon, around 3 o'clock for my annual visit. If you want to talk, maybe you could meet me there. I understand if this feels too complicated after so much time. Love, Sarah." Frank read the message 17 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and possibility. Sarah had been planning to visit Jenny's grave, just as Maria had predicted. But more importantly, she'd been carrying her own burden of unfinished conversations and unspoken forgiveness. She'd used the word love to sign her message, the same word Frank had struggled to include in his own tentative outreach. The next 24 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Frank found himself preparing for the meeting with the same careful attention he'd once brought to important construction projects. He showered and put on his best shirt, the blue cotton one Margaret had bought him for church services they'd stopped attending after Sarah left home. He practiced different opening remarks, trying to find words that would convey 15 years of regret without overwhelming his daughter with the intensity of his emotions. Princess sat on his kitchen counter, like a tiny ambassador, her faded colors somehow brighter now that she was about to be reunited with the person who'd loved her most. Frank had cleaned the toy carefully, removing the last traces of infection and antiseptic, restoring her to the dignity she'd maintained through decades of childhood adventures and recent medical trauma. At 2:30, Frank drove to the cemetery, with Princess in his shirt pocket and his heart hammering against his ribs. He arrived early, wanting to give himself time to prepare mentally for a conversation that would determine whether the rest of his life would include the daughter he'd never stopped loving. Jenny Rodriguez's grave looked peaceful in the afternoon. Sunlight, the flowers Maria had brought the day before, still fresh and vibrant. Frank stood beside the headstone and tried to imagine what Sarah would look like when she arrived, whether she'd resemble the confident professional from the veterinary clinic website or show traces of the uncertain teenager who'd left his house, with tears streaming down her face. At exactly 3 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled into the cemetery's gravel parking area. Frank watched as a woman emerged from the driver's seat, moving with the careful grace of someone approaching a moment that had been building for years. She was unmistakably Sarah, though 15 years had transformed her from an angry girl into a woman who carried herself with quiet confidence and hard-won wisdom. Sarah walked up the hill slowly, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers, similar to the ones Maria had brought the day before. When she saw Frank standing beside Jenny's grave, she stopped for a moment, as if gathering courage for the final steps of a journey that had taken her 15 years to complete. "Dad," she said simply, and the word contained all the love and hurt and hope that had survived their long separation. "Sarah," Frank replied, his voice breaking on her name. They stood there looking at each other across 3 feet of grass and 15 years of silence. two people who'd been shaped by the same losses in different ways. Sarah was the first to close the distance between them, setting down her flowers and stepping forward with the kind of decisive movement that reminded Frank of Margaret's ability to cut through complicated emotions with simple gestures of love. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I'm sorry I left the way I did. Sorry I stayed away so long. Sorry I let pride keep me from coming home when Mom died." Frank felt his own careful composure crumble at his daughter's apology. She was asking forgiveness for things that had never needed forgiving, taking responsibility for choices he'd forced her to make through his own failure to provide the support and understanding she'd needed during the darkest period of her young life. "No," he said firmly, reaching out to touch her shoulder with the same gentle certainty Maria Rodriguez had shown him the day before. "I'm the one who's sorry, Sarah. I failed you when you needed me most. I let my own guilt and grief turn me into someone you couldn't trust with your pain." They embraced then, standing beside Jenny Rodriguez's grave, while 15 years of separation dissolved in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Frank felt his daughter's tears soaking through his shirt and knew that his own were falling just as freely, washing away the accumulated bitterness and regret that had poisoned too many years of both their lives. When they finally separated, Frank reached into his pocket and pulled out Princess, holding the small toy horse between them like a peace offering and a promise. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, managing a smile that felt rusty from disuse but genuine in ways that surprised him. Sarah took Princess in her hands and laughed through her tears, a sound that carried Frank back to childhood memories of his daughter's joy in simple pleasures and small discoveries. "I can't believe she survived being stuck in Mabel's hoof," Sarah said, examining the toy with the professional eye of someone trained in animal medicine. "She always was tougher than she looked." They talked for 2 hours beside Jenny's grave, sharing 15 years of accumulated stories and experiences. Frank learned about Sarah's veterinary training, her marriage to a kind man named David, who taught high school biology, her 2 children, Emma, age 8, and Michael, age 5, who loved animals and art and adventure with the same intensity their mother had shown at their age. Sarah learned about Frank's gradual withdrawal from community life after Margaret's death, his struggles with loneliness and regret, his growing realization that pride was a poor substitute for connection. She heard about Mrs. Chen's patient friendship and Doc Martinez's wisdom, about the small kindnesses that had kept him functioning even when he'd convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the risk of further loss. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, they made plans to continue their conversation in more comfortable surroundings. Sarah would bring her family to the farm the following weekend, introducing Frank to the grandchildren he'd never known existed, and beginning the careful work of rebuilding relationships that had been interrupted by tragedy but never truly destroyed. "I want Emma and Michael to know their grandfather," Sarah said as they prepared to leave the cemetery. "I want them to see the farm where I grew up and meet Mabel and hear stories about their grandmother. Is that something you'd like too?" Frank's answer came without hesitation, his voice steady with newfound purpose and possibility. "I'd like that more than anything in the world." The week between Sarah's visit to Jenny's grave and her promised return with her family passed in a whirlwind of preparation that reminded Frank of the eager anticipation he'd felt as a young father preparing for Sarah's childhood birthday parties. But this was different, more profound and infinitely more precious because it represented not just celebration but resurrection, the return of hope to a life that had forgotten what hope felt like. Frank's first order of business was purchasing a cell phone, a concession to modern technology that he'd resisted for years, but now recognized as essential for maintaining contact with his newly restored daughter. Mrs. Chen accompanied him to the electronics store in town, patiently explaining the difference between various plans and features, while Frank struggled with the bewildering array of options available to contemporary communicators. The phone itself was a simple flip-style device that reminded Frank of the walkie-talkies he'd used on construction sites decades earlier. The salesperson, a patient young man who called Frank Sir with genuine respect, programmed Sarah's number into the contact list and showed Frank how to send basic text messages. "Don't overthink it," Mrs. Chen advised as they left the store. "Sarah doesn't need you to master 21st century technology. She just needs to know she can reach you when she wants to talk." Frank's first text message to Sarah was characteristically brief. "Got phone, this is Dad. Looking forward to Saturday." Her response came within minutes. "Can't wait for you to meet David and the kids. They're so excited about visiting the farm." The simplicity of the exchange belied its emotional significance. For the first time in 15 years, Frank could reach out to his daughter whenever he felt the urge to share a thought or ask a question. The phone represented more than communication technology. It was a lifeline connecting him to the family he'd thought was lost forever. With communication established, Frank turned his attention to preparing his house and property for visitors who would be seeing it through the eyes of children encountering their grandfather's world for the first time. The realization that Emma and Michael had never been to a working farm added urgency to his preparations. He wanted their first impression to be magical rather than merely adequate. The house required significant attention after years of minimal maintenance and the kind of bachelor housekeeping that prioritized function over appearance. Frank enlisted Mrs. Chen's help in identifying which rooms would need thorough cleaning and which furniture might benefit from rearrangement to accommodate family visits. Margaret's sewing room had become a storage space for items Frank couldn't bear to discard but had no regular use for. Together, Frank and Mrs. Chen sorted through boxes of Christmas decorations, old photographs, and household items that had accumulated layers of dust and memories. They discovered several of Sarah's childhood possessions that Frank had forgotten. He'd saved a jewelry box that played Für Elise when opened, a collection of horse figurines that had occupied an entire shelf in her bedroom, a science fair trophy from 6th grade. "These should go in the guest room where Sarah's family will be staying," Mrs. Chen suggested, handling the jewelry box with the reverence due to artifacts of family history. "The children will love seeing their mother's childhood treasures." Frank had converted Sarah's old bedroom into a generic guest space years earlier, unable to bear the daily reminder of his daughter's absence, but unwilling to completely erase the evidence of her childhood presence in his home. Now he restored some of her personal touches, the artwork back on the walls, the horse figurines arranged on the dresser, the quilt Margaret had sewn displayed on the bed where Sarah would sleep when she came home to visit. The barn required attention as well. Frank spent 2 days cleaning stalls, organizing tools, and making sure the animals' living spaces would meet the standards of a veterinarian daughter who would notice details that escaped most visitors. Mabel seemed to sense the importance of these preparations, following Frank around the property with unusual attentiveness and allowing him to groom her more thoroughly than she'd tolerated in years. "You remember Sarah, don't you, girl?" Frank murmured as he worked on Mabel's coat with a curry brush that hadn't seen regular use since Sarah had left home. "She used to spend hours out here with you when she was little, fed you apples and sugar cubes, and probably told you all her secrets." Mabel's ears pricked forward at the sound of Sarah's name, and Frank could have sworn he saw recognition in the old donkey's intelligent eyes. Animals had long memories for the people who'd shown them kindness, and Sarah had always been gentle with the farm's creatures, treating them as individuals rather than mere livestock. The vegetable garden presented both opportunity and challenge. Frank's tomatoes were approaching peak ripeness, his corn was tall and promising, and his herb garden contained the ingredients Margaret had used in many of Sarah's favorite dishes. But the garden also showed signs of a solitary man's declining attention to aesthetics, weeds in the pathways, irregular watering patterns, a general lack of the careful tending that had characterized Margaret's approach to growing things. Frank spent an entire day weeding, watering, and restoring order to the garden spaces. He wanted Sarah to see that he'd maintained some connection to the life-giving work she remembered from her childhood, even if his technique had become less refined over the years. The garden represented continuity, proof that some parts of the life they'd shared as a family had survived the trauma that had driven them apart. Doc Martinez stopped by midweek to check on Mabel's healing progress and stayed to hear about Frank's upcoming family visit. She examined the donkey's hoof with professional thoroughness, pronouncing herself satisfied with the recovery and predicting complete healing within another week or two. "Mabel's going to outlive us all," she said, patting the donkey's neck with genuine affection. "She's got the constitution of an animal who knows she's needed. Animals like that can live well into their 30s if they're properly cared for." The observation carried special significance given Mabel's role in reuniting Frank with his daughter. The old donkey had been the catalyst for healing that went far beyond her infected hoof, and Frank found himself grateful for her stubborn durability, in ways that went deeper than simple agricultural practicality. "I've been thinking about what you said," Frank told Doc Martinez as they walked back toward her truck, "about healing, requiring the willingness to open up old wounds and clean out what's been festering. I'm starting to understand that the pain of treatment is temporary, but the pain of infection just gets worse if you ignore it." Doc Martinez smiled, clearly pleased to see the practical application of her veterinary metaphor in Frank's personal life. "The hardest part is over now," she said. "You've made contact, you've started the conversation, and your daughter has responded with love instead of anger. Everything from here on out is just the patient work of rebuilding trust and creating new memories together." As Saturday approached, Frank found himself experiencing a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reminded him of the nervous excitement he'd felt before his wedding day. He was about to meet his son-in-law and grandchildren for the first time, to begin relationships that would define the remainder of his life, to step into a role, grandfather, that he'd given up hope of ever fulfilling. Friday evening found Frank sitting on his front porch with Princess in his pocket and his new cell phone on the table beside his chair. The phone had become a tangible connection to Sarah, a reminder that she was no longer lost to him, but simply living her life 200 miles away until the next time they could be together. A text message arrived just as the sun was setting. "Leaving early tomorrow morning. Kids so excited they can barely sleep. See you around 10 a.m. Love, Sarah." Frank typed his response carefully, still adapting to the phone's tiny keyboard. "Coffee will be ready. Can't wait to meet everyone." The evening air carried the scent of honeysuckle and the sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Frank sat on the porch where he'd spent countless solitary evenings over the past 15 years and marveled at how different the same view could look when transformed by hope instead of regret. Tomorrow would bring voices and laughter back to his house, children's footsteps on stairs that had been silent too long, the kind of joyful chaos that had once made his home feel alive. Margaret would have loved meeting her grandchildren, would have had their favorite cookies baked and special activities planned before they'd even arrived. Frank couldn't replace Margaret's nurturing presence, but he could offer something that had been missing from both his life and Sarah's for too long: the simple acknowledgement that families could survive even devastating mistakes if the people involved were willing to choose love over pride, connection over safety, vulnerability over the illusion of self-sufficiency. As he prepared for bed, Frank placed Princess on his nightstand where he could see her from his pillow. Tomorrow, the little plastic horse would complete her journey, home to the daughter who'd loved her first and best. But tonight, she served as a reminder that lost things could be found, broken relationships could be healed, and it was never too late to become the person your family needed you to be. Frank woke at 5:30 Saturday morning, 2 hours earlier than usual, his body vibrating with the kind of nervous energy he remembered from construction days when important inspectors were scheduled to visit job sites. He made coffee with extra care, using the good china cups that had sat unused in Margaret's cabinet for years, and arranged fresh flowers from the garden in the vase Sarah had made in high school pottery class. By 9 o'clock, Frank had checked his appearance in the mirror 6 times, straightened the living room furniture twice, and walked through the house so many times that even the cats seemed concerned about his unusual behavior. Princess sat on the kitchen counter where Sarah would see her immediately upon entering, a small plastic bridge between the girl who'd lost her and the woman who was coming home. At exactly 10 o'clock, a blue minivan turned into Frank's driveway, moving slowly, as if the occupants were taking in every detail of the approach to a place that existed in family stories but had never been visited. Frank watched from his front window as the vehicle came to a stop near the porch steps, his heart hammering with anticipation that felt both wonderful and terrifying. The driver's door opened first, revealing a tall man with gentle eyes and graying hair, who moved with the careful consideration of someone meeting his father-in-law for the first time. This had to be David, the high school biology teacher who'd won Sarah's heart and helped her build the stable family life she'd been denied in her teenage years. Sarah emerged from the passenger seat looking radiant in ways that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with the joy of bringing her worlds together after 15 years of separation. She wore a simple blue dress that reminded Frank of ones Margaret had favored, and her smile held the same warmth that had illuminated Sarah's childhood face during moments of pure happiness. But it was the children who captured Frank's complete attention as they tumbled out of the minivan's sliding door with the boundless energy of young people encountering a new adventure. Emma, at 8 years old, was clearly Sarah's daughter. The same curious eyes, the same way of holding her head when assessing new situations. Michael, 5 years old and built like a small linebacker, bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement. "Grandpa Frank!" Emma called out, running toward the porch with the confidence of a child who'd been told wonderful things about the grandfather she'd never met. She launched herself into Frank's arms before he'd fully processed that she was addressing him, that this beautiful little girl was using the title he'd given up hope of ever hearing. Michael followed more cautiously, hanging back near his parents, while assessing whether this new adult could be trusted with his attention and affection. Frank understood the hesitation. 5-year-olds had good instincts about people, and trust needed to be earned rather than assumed. "Kids," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "this is your grandfather, Grandpa Frank. I'd like you to meet Emma and Michael." Frank knelt down to Emma's level, bringing himself into Michael's comfort zone as well, and felt 15 years of loneliness evaporate in the presence of these children who carried his daughter's genetic legacy forward into a future he'd thought would exclude him entirely. "I'm very happy to meet you both," Frank said, his voice steadier than he'd expected it to be. "Your mom has told me wonderful things about you, and I've been looking forward to showing you around the farm." "Do you really have a donkey?" Michael asked, his shyness overcome by curiosity about the animals his mother had described. "Mum says she's really old and really smart." "Mabel is 23 years old," Frank replied seriously, recognizing that factual information was often the best way to connect with young minds. "She's older than your mother, and definitely smarter than me most days." Both children giggled at this admission, and Frank felt some of his nervous tension begin to ease. Children were remarkably forgiving of adult awkwardness if you treated them with respect and didn't try too hard to win their approval. Sarah stepped forward and hugged Frank again, this embrace different from their emotional reunion at Jenny's grave, warmer, more natural, the kind of greeting that suggested their relationship was rebuilding itself on a foundation of genuine affection rather than obligation or guilt. "Dad," she said, "I'd like you to meet my husband, David." David Walsh stepped forward with a firm handshake and a smile that reached his eyes, clearly a man who understood the significance of this moment for both Frank and Sarah. "Mr. Delaney," he said, "Sarah has told me so much about growing up here. Thank you for having us." Frank found himself liking David immediately. His straightforward manner, his obvious devotion to Sarah and the children, his lack of judgment about the complicated family history that had brought them together after so many years of separation. "Call me Frank," he said, meaning it, "and thank you for taking such good care of my daughter. I can see she's happy, and that means everything to me." The words hung in the morning air like a blessing, acknowledging both the years of separation and the possibility of connection that stretched ahead of them. Frank had found his family again, and for the first time in 15 years, the future felt like something worth anticipating rather than simply enduring. The morning unfolded with the easy rhythm of a family reunion that had been 15 years in the making. Frank led his unexpected guests through the house that Sarah remembered from childhood, watching her face as she pointed out details that had remained unchanged. The kitchen window where she'd watched for the school bus, the staircase banister she'd slid down despite Margaret's gentle scolding, the living room corner where the Christmas tree had stood every December of her youth. Emma and Michael absorbed these stories with the fascination children bring to tales of their parents' mysterious lives before parenthood. They examined Sarah's childhood artwork with the critical eye of young artists, commenting on her choice of colors and her ambitious attempts to capture farm life in crayon and watercolor. "Mom, you weren't very good at drawing people," Emma observed, with the brutal honesty of an 8-year-old critic. "Everyone has stick arms and huge heads." "I was better at drawing animals," Sarah replied, laughing at her daughter's assessment. "Animals were more patient about holding still, while I figured out how to make them look right." Frank found Princess on the kitchen counter where he'd left her and presented the toy horse to Sarah with ceremony befitting a crown jewel returning to its rightful owner. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she took the familiar weight in her hands, remembering the comfort this small plastic companion had provided during the turbulent final months of her childhood. "This is Princess," Sarah told Emma and Michael, holding up the faded toy for their inspection. "She was my special horse when I was your age. I took her everywhere with me." "She's pretty small," Michael observed with 5-year-old pragmatism. "Did you pretend to ride her?" "I pretended she was real," Sarah said, her voice soft with memory. "I made up stories about her adventures, and I told her all my secrets. When I was scared or sad, holding Princess made me feel better." Emma reached out to touch the toy horse with careful fingers, recognizing the reverence in her mother's voice. "Can I hear one of the Princess stories?" Frank watched Sarah's face as she considered her daughter's request, seeing the moment when past and present converged in the kind of storytelling that passes family mythology from one generation to the next. They settled on the living room couch, the same couch where Margaret had read bedtime stories to Sarah decades earlier, while Sarah spun tales of Princess's magical journeys through enchanted forests and across rainbow bridges. The tour of the farm proved to be the day's main attraction for Emma and Michael. Frank had worried that children accustomed to suburban amenities might find his modest agricultural operation underwhelming, but he'd underestimated the appeal of real animals and wide open spaces to young minds hungry for adventure. Mabel was the undisputed star of the farm tour. The old donkey seemed to recognize Sarah immediately, approaching her with the same gentle affection she'd shown 23 years earlier, when Sarah was a little girl feeding her sugar cubes and carrots. Sarah ran her hands along Mabel's neck, with the professional touch of a veterinarian, combined with the emotional connection of someone revisiting a beloved childhood companion. "She remembers you," Frank said, watching the reunion with wonder. "I swear she knew you were coming back." Emma and Michael were initially cautious around Mabel, but the donkey's patient demeanor and Frank's careful instruction soon had them, feeding her apple slices and giggling at the tickle of her whiskers against their palms. Frank found himself remembering Sarah at their age, fearless around animals and quick to anthropomorphize every creature on the farm. "Can we ride her?" Michael asked with the boundless optimism of a child who believed all requests were potentially grantable. Mabel's retired from riding, Frank explained gently. She's earned the right to just be a companion now. But if you'd like to brush her coat, I think she'd enjoy that. David proved to be as comfortable around animals as his wife. Clearly, someone who'd grown up understanding the rhythms of rural life. He helped Frank demonstrate proper animal care techniques to the children while engaging in the kind of easy conversation that suggested their relationship would develop naturally rather than being forced by family obligation. Sarah tells me, "You taught her everything she knows about caring for animals," David said, as they watched the children brush Mabel's coat with serious concentration. "Margaret and I started the teaching," Frank replied, "but Sarah had natural instincts that went far beyond anything we could have taught her. She always knew when an animal was hurting or frightened. That's not something you can learn from books." As afternoon stretched toward evening, Frank realized this was the first day in 15 years when he hadn't felt lonely even once. His house was full of voices and laughter. His farm was being explored with wonder and delight, and his dinner table would seat a complete family for the first time since Margaret's death. The healing that had begun with a simple veterinary visit was complete, now transformed into something richer and more complex than mere reconciliation. Frank had found his way back to being a father, a grandfather, a central figure in the ongoing story of a family that had learned to value connection over pride, love over safety, hope over the comfortable certainties of solitude. Princess sat on the windowsill, watching over the reunion she had made possible, a small plastic reminder that lost things could be found, and broken relationships could be healed if people were willing to believe in the possibility of second chances. 6 months later, Frank's kitchen table bore the comfortable clutter of a house where family gathered regularly. Emma's math homework shared space with Michael's crayon drawings. Sarah's veterinary journals sat beside David's biology lesson plans, and Frank's reading glasses rested atop a newspaper crossword puzzle he'd been working on when the familiar sound of tires on gravel announced another weekend visit. The transformation in Frank's life had been gradual but profound. The silence that had defined his existence for 15 years had been replaced by a constant stream of phone calls, text messages, and impromptu visits that kept him connected to the daily rhythms of his daughter's family. He'd learned to navigate Emma's school science projects and Michael's endless questions about farm animals. He'd become the grandfather who knew which cookies each child preferred and which bedtime stories would guarantee peaceful sleep. Mabel had become the unofficial mascot of these family gatherings, patient with small hands that sometimes forgot to be gentle and generous with her attention when children needed the comfort that only animals seemed able to provide. Her complete recovery from the infection that had nearly cost her mobility served as a living symbol of the healing that had transformed all their lives. "Grandpa Frank," Emma called from the living room, where she was arranging her collection of toy horses, a collection that now included the original Princess along, with several newer additions Frank had surprised her with over the past months. "Can you tell us the story about how you found Princess again?" Frank settled into Margaret's old rocking chair, which had become his designated storytelling seat during family visits. The chair creaked familiarly as Emma and Michael arranged themselves on the floor beside him, ready to hear a tale they'd requested dozens of times, but never tired of hearing. "Well," Frank began, his voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller, "it all started when old Mabel began limping worse than usual. I loaded her into the trailer, thinking we'd just get her foot looked at and be home in time for lunch." The story had acquired layers and embellishments over the months of repeated telling, becoming less about the medical facts of Mabel's infection and more about the miraculous nature of second chances and the mysterious ways that love could survive, even the longest separations. Emma and Michael knew all the details by heart, but they listened with the rapt attention children bring to stories that confirm their belief in magic and happy endings. Sarah appeared in the doorway during Frank's recounting of Doc Martinez's careful work to remove Princess from Mabel's hoof. She leaned against the doorframe with the satisfied expression of someone watching her children absorb family history through the gentle repetition of beloved stories. David stood behind her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder in a gesture of easy affection that spoke of a marriage built on mutual respect and shared values. And that's how Princess came home after being lost for 15 years, Frank concluded, accepting the ritual embrace from both grandchildren that marked the end of their favorite story. "Tell us about Grandma Margaret now," Michael requested, settling back onto the floor with the expectation of another tale from the family archives. Frank's ability to speak about Margaret without overwhelming sadness was perhaps the most significant measure of his emotional healing. The grief would always be present, but it no longer dominated every memory or poisoned every reference to their shared life. Margaret had become a benevolent presence in his storytelling, a character whose love and wisdom continued to influence the family she'd helped create, even though she couldn't be physically present to enjoy her grandchildren. "Your Grandma Margaret," Frank began, his voice warm with affection rather than loss, "was the kind of person who could make anyone feel special just by paying attention to them. When your mom was little, Margaret would spend hours listening to her ideas about how to improve the farm or make the animals more comfortable. These stories served multiple purposes. They connected Emma and Michael to the grandmother they'd never met. They preserved Margaret's memory as a living influence rather than a tragic absence, and they demonstrated to Sarah that her mother's love continued to shape the family, even after death had claimed her physical presence. As evening approached and Sarah's family prepared to return to their own home 200 miles away, Frank found himself experiencing the familiar mixture of contentment and anticipation that had replaced the desolation of his solitary years. He would miss their voices and laughter, but he no longer feared that each goodbye might be permanent. They would return next weekend, or the weekend after, and his phone would carry their daily communications until they could be physically present again. The new family photograph sitting on Frank's mantelpiece told the story of transformation more eloquently than words could manage. 5 people stood in front of the barn where Sarah had played as a child, their arms around each other with the easy affection of people who'd learned to value connection over the prideful independence that had once seemed safer but had ultimately proven hollow. Princess occupied a place of honor on Emma's bedroom shelf at her parents' house, but she returned to Frank's farm during every visit, serving as a bridge between past and present, loss and recovery, the child Sarah had been and the woman she'd become. The little plastic horse had completed her most important journey, not from Frank's pocket back to Sarah's hands, but from symbol of separation to emblem of reunion. As Frank waved goodbye from his front porch, watching tail lights disappear down his driveway, he thought about the unexpected ways that healing could arrive in ordinary lives. Sometimes salvation came disguised as routine veterinary care. Sometimes the deepest wounds required the smallest keys to unlock them. Sometimes the things we thought we'd lost forever were simply waiting for us to develop the courage to go looking. For them, the farm was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, peaceful rather than lonely, expectant rather than resigned. Frank had learned the difference between solitude chosen and solitude imposed, between the silence of withdrawal and the silence of contentment. His life had been given back to him through the discovery of a child's lost toy, and he'd learned to live it with gratitude for second chances and hope for all the tomorrows that stretched ahead like an open road leading home.